Our speaker today is Dr. Brian Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a professor in the Physics and Astronomy Department at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. Since 2003, he has worked on various problems related to the understanding of how the history of life on Earth may have been affected by high-energy astrophysical events, such as gamma-ray bursts and supernova. He and his collaborators from multiple disciplines have produced the most detailed and state-of-the-art studies of the effects on Earth by nearby stellar explosion. Dr. Thomas has a BS in physics from the University of the Pacific and a PhD in physics from the University of Kansas. So let me give you Dr. Thomas.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for coming out to hear about exploding stars and life on Earth. I'm going to share my screen, but first I'll say I'm happy to take questions, and as Judy said, you can drop them in the chat, and I think she'll be watching that, and I will try and take a look at it as well. Yeah, so my name is Brian Thomas, and I am at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, and I've been there for almost 20 years now. I got my PhD at KU just before that, so I've been in Kansas for a long time, but I am actually a West Coast native, and I lived in California for most of my childhood and my undergraduate time as well. So I'm happy to be virtually back on the West Coast, as it were. All right, so I wanted to walk you through some kind of background information on the astronomy and astrophysics aspect of this, and then connect that to life on Earth and give you some of the results of the work that we have done. My background is in physics, and I have done some work in cosmology, which is the study of the large-scale structure of the universe. And recently, most of my work has been focused on Earth's atmosphere and how it reacts to high-energy radiation events. So I kind of got interested in this problem because it's a very big picture kind of problem. And so I want to start not necessarily at the very beginning, but kind of at the beginning of this field. And it was really way back in the 1950s that a German paleontologist was one of the first, maybe not the first, but one of the first people at least to propose that mass extinctions that were known in Earth's fossil record might be connected to things that happen very far off in space, exploding stars like supernovae. At the time, there wasn't a huge amount known about either mass extinctions or supernova explosions. Of course, there was a lot of data, but not all the details were worked out yet. So it was speculative at the time, sort of a maybe reasonable hypothesis, but no one had really done anything beyond that. For quite a while, that was a state of the art. And one of the barriers here, of course, is that this is a very large question, and it does cover lots of different disciplines. So gathering together people who understand all of the different aspects and kind of putting them in one room and getting them to solve this problem is not necessarily so easy. So I wanted to give you a little background on the kinds of astrophysical events that we're interested in, and there are a whole range of them. I'm going to focus primarily on supernova explosions and their related cousin, the gamma ray burst. So as you may or may not know anything about the kind of star formation and how this works in an astrophysics context, none of that's terribly important, but the bottom line is stars go through a life cycle. They form out of the interstellar medium. They go through some processes in their kind of middle life. And then depending on their mass, they either have more of a slow, quiet kind of endpoint or a more dramatic, explosive endpoint. So for a relatively massive star, somewhere about 8 times the sun's mass and above, a supernova explosion can be expected. Generally speaking, a supernova explosion destroys the entire star and converts a big fraction of its energy into light and kinetic energy of the bits of the star being blown out into the surrounding space. Actually, it turns out almost all of the energy is released in neutrinos, which are streaming throughout the universe and interact with almost nothing. But that's sort of a side story. It's an interesting one. You can ask me about it later if you like. Okay, so when these massive stars explode, they produce this supernova. A general generic kind of supernova is more or less spherical. It expands out in all directions, more or less the same. There are special cases of supernovae called gamma ray bursts. These are called gamma ray bursts because we see them as a burst, a short, intense blast of gamma rays, high energy photons. But the reason for that is we happen to be looking down kind of the barrel of the gun in a particular kind of supernova. So for certain types of stars that are spinning very rapidly, that explode in a certain way, they produce a jet of radiation, kind of like you may have seen for something like an accreting black hole. Similar idea, it produces this jet. And if we happen to be looking down that particular direction, we get a very intense blast of this gamma rays. So gamma ray bursts are sort of a special case of supernovae. They are much more intense when we are observing them down that beam. Otherwise, they look more or less like a regular supernova on the higher end of the energy scale. So these are very energetic events. Gamma ray bursts are not very common. We don't see them very often, especially close by. Supernovae are more common, but still within our region, our general area, there hasn't been one observed for hundreds of years at least. There have been a few naked eye supernovae, but it's been quite a while. So they're not an everyday occurrence by any means, at least in our local area. In the universe, they're everyday, but not right here. Okay, so I mentioned that Otto Schindenwolf was the first person to really come up with this idea, at least to publish about it. Probably not the first to think about it, but the first to publish about it. And in the later 70s and into the all the way into the 90s, people started to think more precisely about what it would look like for a supernova to occur near the Earth and how that might affect life on Earth. There were initially some basically just theoretical calculations, fairly simple pencil and paper sorts of calculations, trying to get a handle on what would happen here. And people pretty quickly realized that one of the most important effects would be changes in the atmosphere. So, not necessarily a direct blast of radiation. It's not like we're directly exposed to space and whatever happens out there just immediately irradiates us. We are protected by our atmosphere to a large extent by almost everything that's out there, but there's a limit. And if we put too much energy into the atmosphere, it can destroy molecules, they recombine, and cause changes in the chemistry. In particular, what was identified in the late 70s and has been studied more extensively since then is changes in ozone. So you might know that ozone in the stratosphere, fairly high in the atmosphere, is protective against UV light from the sun. So there is the so-called ozone hole over Antarctica, which comes and goes and is recovering, we think. That was a concern because we know that if the ozone is not there, we get a lot more UV from the sun. It causes skin cancer and other kinds of problems. So ozone's important in the atmosphere in protecting life. There are life forms that are resistant to UV and would be fine, but a lot of life is very severely damaged by UV from the sun that's normally blocked by ozone. There are also potentially climate effects. There's a couple of different aspects of that. One is that ozone itself is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. There's not much of it in the atmosphere, so it doesn't play a huge role in our current climate state, but it does play a role in changes, and it will change the radiative balance, which affects the Earth's temperature. Another interesting idea that people came up with was that we should be able to see actual physical remnants of a supernova, if it happened near enough, in the form of radioactive iron atoms, which would be transported to Earth, deposited in the ocean and on the ground, and incorporated into geologic columns that people could go out and look for. The way this works is that supernovae are the producers, the factories of heavy elements in the universe. So all of that energy that gets released, some of it goes into smashing nuclei together to make heavy elements. And one of the elements that's made is a radioactive form of iron. And I'll say more about that in a second. So these initial ideas were at least informative, but we wanted to, of course, get more detailed, right? And so in the early 2000s, I started working on this, and that was right after a group had published a paper looking at the supernova effects using a numerical simulation of Earth's atmosphere. So NASA Goddard Space Flight Center had a state-of-the-art model of the atmosphere, which had been used to study ozone depletion, and particularly the Antarctic ozone hole. These guys, led by Neil Gehrels, applied this to the question of a supernova. And so they tried to understand what would happen in the atmosphere in a much more detailed way than had ever been done. Doing these simulations, inputting what we think would happen as far as the energy received and the type of energy and how much and whatnot, and trying to see what would happen with the atmosphere, its response. Right around that time, just after this paper was published, I had been working in cosmology, and that's me there in my office in Malott Hall at the University of Kansas. And that desk right there had some dents in it because I kept banging my head into it because the project I was working on was terrible. And so I was tired of doing that project and I wanted to move on to something else. And my thesis advisor, Adrian, was gracious enough to say, "Hey, yeah, that sounds good. Let's find something interesting to do." And so we read this paper about the supernova, and we both thought, that sounds exciting. Let's do that. The problem was I didn't really know much about atmospheres. I had been working in cosmology. I knew a lot of astrophysics and things like that, but not so much about Earth's atmosphere. So I learned that, but it was an interesting journey to go from one field to another, and I'll say a little more about that later on. That's kind of a side story here, but I think it's an interesting one. Oftentimes, people don't get the opportunity to just change fields, and I was kind of lucky to be able to do that. So again, one of the special cases of a supernova, a gamma ray burst, is the thing that I focused on primarily when I started out. So Neil Gehrels and his crew were studying a supernova. We wanted to do something a little bit different, and we saw a study looking at gamma ray bursts as a possible impact on the Earth, but they hadn't done any particular studies of it in detail. So we thought, well, why don't we put these tools together? Why don't we take that atmospheric model, take what's known about gamma ray bursts, put them together, and do a similar kind of study? So that's what I did my PhD thesis on. I spent several years working on this particular problem. There's a couple of different types of gamma ray bursts, and they differ primarily in their duration. So they're long gamma ray bursts are a few seconds to a few tens of seconds long. They're still pretty short, hence the burst name. A short burst is less than a second. Otherwise, they have pretty similar properties. They are a little bit different in terms of the amount of energy that they output and the relative amounts of different energies of photons, but more or less they're all the same basic idea, just a different duration. So we chose to focus on long gamma ray bursts. At the time, there was a lot more known about them. Since then, there have been a lot more observations of short gamma ray bursts, and we know more about them than we used to. And we've done some follow-up studies on that. But I'll focus on the long variety for the most part. So we took this atmospheric model, and I actually went out to Goddard Space Flight Center and met Neil and Charlie Jackman, who was the other main author on that, and learned all of this atmospheric stuff, kind of a crash course on atmospheric modeling. And that's one of the great things about graduate school. You can just kind of drop everything and learn something new, which is a lot of fun. But basically, I applied this model to what we knew about gamma ray bursts and tried to understand what would happen to the atmosphere. We had a good idea of what would happen with a supernova. This is kind of an extreme case of that, so we could bootstrap from where they had started into this new area. What we found is that there would be a massive change in the Earth's ozone layer, as had been originally hypothesized with those initial calculations in the 70s. We had established that, yes, this would be definitely an important impact. Now, when we knock out ozone, we introduce more UV light to the surface. Essentially, this is damaging to any kind of life that has to live in the sun. There are some other effects that might be important as well, but that seems to be the biggest one. So the basic idea here is that we think even for a short gamma ray burst, even for a few seconds or possibly even less, that energy comes in, it produces this atmospheric chemistry change, ozone is destroyed, we get lots of UV light from the sun, and especially primary producers, plants, and photosynthetic life in the ocean, we think would be impacted by this especially, which could lead to a mass extinction. So it's hard to connect the dots between mass extinction and gamma ray bursts or supernovae in a very clear, direct way. We're looking mostly at correlative kinds of ideas here. So that's still the state of the art because it is difficult to make those connections. We mainly make arguments about plausibility of, yes, this could contribute because it's significant enough to cause an impact on life. It turns out that the details are quite complicated. And my training is definitely not in biology, but a big component of this is in biology. So I went out and searched the literature for people studying the effects of ultraviolet light on primary producers. And I was fortunate enough to snag the interest of my current and recent collaborator, Patrick Neal, shown here. And he is an expert in ocean phytoplankton, and he is an expert in irradiating them with UV light to see what happens. So we combined his experimental approach with my modeling and basically just zapped phytoplankton with what we think would happen during a gamma ray burst to see what would happen. And the results were interesting. We found actually a much smaller impact on the species that we studied than we expected. And the main idea is that the species we're studying are already exposed to a lot of UV, so they probably wouldn't be that impacted. Um, there are other species that we have not directly tested, but other people have looked at those impacts, and we've used some of their results and find a bigger effect. So one of the interesting takeaways is that there's a big variation depending on what kind of organism you're looking at and even species within types. So that uncertainty is still pretty large, and we don't really know exactly what the overall impact would be. We know that it would be significant on some organisms and not so much on others. So biology is complicated, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. Okay, so a little more on supernovae, and then I'll get into what we've been doing more recently because we've been focused on supernovae in the last few years. Again, supernovae are the explosion of one of these high mass stars. They do produce visible light. That's how they're typically observed initially. They also produce high energy light, gamma rays, X-rays, UV light. The gamma rays actually primarily come from decay and X-rays, radioactive decay of certain elements that are produced in the supernova explosion. When you're talking about the light that we receive, this is generally visible for a few months, maybe a year or so, depending on the event. What's left behind we call a remnant, and this is the remnant of the star that's blasted out into space. And usually there is surrounding material as well, some of it produced by the star in its later life, some of it just the general interstellar medium. And that can get accelerated and shocked. And in that process, protons and other elements, but primarily protons, can get accelerated to very high energies. And those end up being what we call cosmic rays. So in this process, we get a lot of light radiation, and we also get particle radiation. We also get heavy elements produced, and one of those is this radioactive isotope of iron called iron 60. Iron 60 is not produced via any other mechanism that we know of, only in supernova explosions, in nature at least. And so this was identified as a key item that we might go out and look for in order to identify nearby supernovae, at least within the last few million years. It does have about a 2.5 million year half-life. So we can't go back too far with it, unfortunately, but we can look for the remnants that might still be around. So people have actually gone out and looked for this, and spoiler alert, found it. The idea here is debris from the supernova gets blasted out into space. Some of it arrives at the Earth. It filters down through the atmosphere, mixes into the water cycle, gets absorbed into the ocean, and then incorporated into precipitates that form in the ocean sediment. And then folks can go out and look for it. And geologists have done this. They have taken ocean cores all over the world in multiple different places. And in 99, an initial detection was found, which was fairly uncertain, not very well established. In 2004, another detection was reported. And then in 2016, a whole raft of detections were reported, most of them in the journal Nature. And so we now know with very high confidence that a supernova, or probably several, happened within a relatively close by. Okay, so there are multiple different measurements in different sorts of cores from around the world, looking at iron manganese crust and these nodules, as well as in magnetotactic bacteria, which absorb iron to make little magnets, crazily enough, and they incorporate that iron 60 as well. So what we see is a big spike in this iron 60, right around 2.5 million years or so. This was a 2004 paper, which was fairly clear, but not quite as high resolution. And then this is a 2016 paper. This 2.5 million year signal is very clear. There's another one that's suggestive around 8 million years, and that has been since firmed up a little bit, but is still fairly uncertain. So what we know with pretty high confidence is there must have been at least one, probably several supernovae within probably 300 light years or so, maybe a little closer. And the debris that we find was produced by those supernovae. There's also been detections in lunar crust samples brought back from the Apollo missions, direct detection in space by experiments on the International Space Station, and these magnetotactic bacteria. Again, I have to put a picture of those in because they're just so cool. Got little beads of magnets in them that they, I guess, help to orient or something. I'm not sure. I'm not a magnetotactic bacteria person, but it's pretty cool anyway. So lots of different detections. We know that there's supernovae that happened relatively nearby within the last few million years. Okay, so we wanted to study this in more detail, and there was this, of course, a lot of motivation with these detections coming out. Now we have solid evidence that these occurred. What can we do with that direct evidence that will tell us something more concrete about the effects on the Earth? So we did get a NASA grant to do this and applied the simulations that we had done before with previous supernovae and with gamma ray bursts. I used my knowledge and experience from that and applied it to these new supernova observations. One of the interesting things we found is not just ozone depletion, but also a direct radiation effect. I mentioned earlier that the atmosphere protects us pretty well, and it really does. But one of the things that's interesting about cosmic rays, these high energy accelerated protons and other isotopes, but primarily protons, when they enter the atmosphere, they interact with nuclei, hydrogen and oxygen primarily, and it produces a what we call a shower of secondary particles. So there's gamma rays, there's pions, neutrons, muons, a whole zoo of different particles that are produced by this. And one of the most important is this muon. If you've never heard of a muon, you can think of it as like an electron, but heavier. There are both positive and negative versions of the muon, and they behave similarly to electrons, but they do have more mass. That makes them very penetrating. So they have a fairly high amount of energy. They can penetrate through pretty effectively both the atmosphere as well as water and rock, and they can have negative effects on biology. So these cosmic rays that are produced by the supernova are actually, we think, the more interesting part of the whole story here. So the atmospheric chemistry changes and ozone depletion are important, but the high energy cosmic rays are really not only an atmospheric effect, but also a direct effect for life on Earth. We think that larger bodied organisms might be more affected by this, mainly because muons are so penetrating. If you've got little microscopic plankton floating at the top of the ocean, they're going to be affected by UV to some extent, but the muons are likely to pass right through unhindered entirely. Something like the megalodon, on the other hand, might have gotten more of a dose. One of my collaborators published a paper speculating that the megalodon extinction may have been affected by this. We think now that that's probably not the case. Some follow-up studies have shown that the radiation event was probably not quite as intense as we originally thought, but still kind of a fun idea. One of the interesting side effects of cosmic rays is a increase in low-level ionization in the atmosphere and potentially more lightning and possibly more wildfires. And we've actually gone out and looked for a signature of more wildfires around the time where we know supernova occurred, and there is some correlation here. It's messy, and we certainly aren't going to say that it was an absolute one-to-one, but there is an evidence for increased fires around this time, and we think that could be connected to the increase in ionization causing more lightning storms. So it's an interesting connection. An interesting connection there is that early hominids were transitioning out of the trees around this time, and that was probably accelerated, although there's some debate about this, by transitions from trees to grassland areas, so from more forested to more open, which of course is preferentially affected by wildfires. So it's possible we have speculated before that supernova might have influenced this early transition, and there's a lot of uncertainty here. certainly acknowledge that, but it's an interesting potential connection. So broadly, our results with high confidence are that there were definitely multiple supernovae um, around 150 to 300 light years. Making this estimate depends on understanding the astrophysics of how elements are produced in supernovae, as well as understanding how the energy transports from there to here. We know with good confidence it's somewhere in that range, and that it happened around 2.5 million years ago, and less confidently around 8 million years ago. We're confident that this would increase the cosmic ray flux, those accelerated particles that get ejected from the supernova. And we're confident that that would have interesting effects, in particular atmospheric ionization and ozone depletion as well. Some possibilities are these ideas that I've mentioned, including enhanced UV at the ground. We think that's a pretty big, it's pretty likely. The overall biological effects are uncertain, but we think that the enhanced UV would be likely to be a problem. We think that enhanced muon radiation is probably detrimental to at least certain forms of life, maybe bigger ones more than smaller ones. And we think there might be this connection between ionization, lightning, and fires. People generally want to know, do I need to worry about this? And the short answer is no, you do not need to worry about getting killed by a supernova anytime soon. The main reason for that is we don't know of any nearby that will cause these kinds of effects. In terms of big picture, the history of life on Earth, how often might these happen? These estimates are tricky to make because we don't have perfect information about where and when these occur, but based on our observations of current rates of supernovae and gamma ray bursts and looking at the history of the universe as we look farther away, we look farther back in time, we can see how these rates have changed. In general, we think that for a supernova at around 30 light years, which is probably close enough to cause significant damage, we think there's about one every few 100 million years, maybe 300 or 400 million years. For gamma ray bursts, it's probably a similar rate or a little bit lower, but the effect is the same at much larger distances. So for gamma ray bursts, they can be from hundreds to thousands of light years away, and we think have a potentially significant impact on the Earth. And then, of course, less severe events would happen much more often because they can be farther away. So as far as the overall effects go, it does depend on the type of the object or the type of the event, how much energy it produces in particular, as well as how far away it is. Those are really our two key parameters there as far as what the main effects might be on the Earth. Yeah, so we think that supernovae and gamma ray bursts are potentially significant over the history of life on Earth over the past few 100 million years. We know that life on Earth has lived under an oxygen or an ozone shield because of high atmospheric oxygen for probably at least 1 billion years or more. And so within that time scale, having a supernova or gamma ray burst that affects the ozone and potentially increases other radiation, we think could have a significant effect on life. Generally speaking, ozone depletion is a universal kind of effect here. The severity depends on the distance and the particular type of event. We do think that would have a negative impact. Connecting it to a mass extinction is tricky, though, because some organisms are strongly affected, some are not so much. But we do think that we would expect some noticeable kind of damage. When we do have an event like a supernova that produces a lot of high energy charged particles, cosmic rays, we have high confidence that we would expect significant effects from that, in particular this muon radiation, as well as the atmospheric chemistry changes. One of the things that I mentioned earlier on that was initially proposed was potential impacts on climate from changes in ozone. And that turns out to be a pretty complicated question. A couple of my students and I have been working on this for the past couple of years, trying to figure out exactly what that might look like. And it's complicated, as much of this is. We think that there could be some effect, but probably not as dramatic as people originally thought. Generally speaking, we think that for events that are reasonable over a few 100 million years, we would expect to see some significant effect on life on Earth. The details are certainly fuzzy simply because biology is complicated and exactly how that, the ecosystem responds is not very well known. I mentioned earlier that I switched fields essentially, and that was kind of an unusual thing to do. And one of the things I like to point out to general audiences is that academia is often very kind of singular. We work on one single kind of idea for a very long time, and that has advantages because you can get very deep into it, but it has disadvantages too because we often are not uh, able to explore the wide variety of things that are out there that might be interesting. So one of the things that I've really appreciated and I feel kind of lucky to have been able to do is explore the many different aspects of this question. And I've relied on collaborators and helpful people who have responded to cold emails politely and helped me to learn all of this various interesting stuff. So I think this is a big takeaway for really anyone because being willing and able to work outside of our intellectual comfort zone is really a useful thing when we want to solve interesting problems. And of course, I want to mention all of my collaborators and students who have helped me over the years. I've had wonderful people to work with, and that's certainly made it both more successful and more interesting. If you are interested in technical papers, you can find all of them in preprint form on the archive, arxiv.org. And you can also check out my profile on ORCID, which is a researcher database, essentially. Of course, want to acknowledge that I've gotten some funding from the NASA exobiology program in the past, which is greatly appreciated as well. I think that's that. So I would love to take your questions.
We have several questions. Does Betelgeuse about heavy elements? What is your opinion on the theory that only red dwarf collisions, not supernovae, could create those elements?
As far as what causes supernovae in general, there are different types, and I mentioned the main type that we study, which is what's called a core collapse, where a massive star collapses and explodes. There are explosive events that are mergers. Typically, we're talking about mergers of compact objects like neutron stars or black holes. Not so much sort of normal main sequence stars. Usually that would be called a kilonova. Some gamma ray bursts, the short variety, are probably caused by merger events, in particular neutron star mergers. So I don't think there's very many ideas about supernova being caused by normal stars like red dwarfs colliding. That's a pretty unusual event. Most stars don't undergo that kind of collision. Neutron stars do because they're very massive and they have a very strong gravitational pull. So if they're relatively nearby, their orbits decay via gravitational wave radiation. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that covers your question, but I hope it does.
How do you determine a half-life of 2.6 million years?
In general, and this is I'm not an expert in measuring half-lives, so I'm telling you as I understand it, what folks do who do this kind of thing is you have a sample of an element, and essentially you measure how long it takes that sample to decay. So what I mean by decay is all elements have a nucleus. That nucleus can be stable or unstable. If it is unstable, it breaks apart, forming different elements. That process is a random process, so any given nucleus, you don't have any expiration date in particular, but when that happens, it happens sort of randomly, and within a sample of, say, 1 million different nuclei, a certain number will decay over a certain time period. So that's the kind of thing that can be measured, how many decayed, how much time went by, and from that you can develop what's called the half-life, which is how long it takes for half of the sample to decay.
How fast does the iron atoms ejected by the supernova move? How close does the supernova have to be so they don't decay before getting to the Earth?
So those ejected particles are going to be moving at a pretty good fraction of the speed of light. Um, they're moving very fast, and in general, if we're within a few hundred light years or so, we would expect some deposition that would be detectable. I didn't mention it, but the people who do these measurements do incredibly precise measurements. They're measuring down to a few atoms, and so the precision is incredible. But yeah, you do have to be with a certain range, or it's diluted so much that wouldn't be able to detect it. So a few hundred light years is probably about the limit.
What would happen if you smashed a muon into a muon?
And nuclear interactions are something I haven't studied since grad school, and I'm rusty on them. So I'm not sure I can answer that precisely. Nothing terribly exciting, I think, because muons are elementary particles. They're not made up of anything else. So I'm guessing that they would probably just bounce off of each other if you're talking about like charges, so two negative muons, for instance. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that in a very long time, maybe at all. So I'll have to look that up.
Does Betelgeuse going supernova not pose some threat to Earth?
So it turns out that Betelgeuse is too far away to cause any significant effects here, although it should be a pretty spectacular light show. We should be able to see it, and it'll be pretty dramatic as far as that goes, but too far away, we think, to cause any really damaging effects. So good for us, I guess.
Are there ways of mitigating effects of a gamma ray burst hitting Earth as there is for electromagnetic pulse?
Well, I think the short answer is no. Short of putting up a barrier that blocks light, which probably is a bad idea for other reasons, there's really nothing we can do. One of the main reasons for that is that we can't see it coming, other than having some very direct information that an event is going to happen, like we see a progenitor that we know will produce one of these. We don't know that a gamma ray burst or a supernova has happened until the light gets here, and so at that time it's basically too late. So there's really not much we can do, actually.
Would the kinetic force of a gamma explosion nearby disrupt the asteroid belts nearby, potentially causing meteor showers?
When we have a supernova or a gamma ray burst occur, the physical pressure is actually very small as far as we would get here, within any reasonable distance. Within the history of the universe, we're unlikely to have any close enough to cause enough of a push to affect orbits of any kind of objects in the solar system.
Can muons be found or created on Earth? And if so, can they be used for electronic charges similar to electrons?
As far as muons go, yes, muons are produced all the time in natural radioactive decay, and in particular in things like particle accelerators. In fact, there are at particle accelerator facilities something called muon beam dumps, where they just deposit muons. They can't be used in some kind of like circuitry, like electrons. That's a really interesting idea, but they can't be used that way because they are very short-lived. They only live for a fraction of a second before they decay into other particles. So the reason we can get some on the ground is that they live long enough to travel through the atmosphere when they're produced in the upper atmosphere. But it turns out that you can't really do much with them because they don't live very long.
Carlin said he watched a video that said that you can destroy the sun with water or bring the particles beyond the limit. If the particles aren't beyond the limit, the sun can literally come back together.
And it looks like maybe Carlin is raising his hand too, but I'll try and answer this question. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure what you're thinking of here. I'll try to answer best as I can. One idea here may be that if you take an object which is gravitationally held together, that is, all the particles are held together by gravity, if you move those particles apart, they could come back together unless you give them enough speed or enough distance away from each other to keep going out. Similar idea to leaving the Earth's surface in a rocket. If you want to leave the Earth's surface and not fall back to Earth, you have to be going a certain speed. We call that escape velocity, and it depends on mainly the mass of the thing that you're near. So the Earth has a particular escape velocity. It's something like 12 kilometers per second. So if you want to leave the Earth and not fall back down, you have to go something like that fast. So you can imagine any kind of object having something like that.
I also watched a video. I think it was a Kerchkazak, something called Kerchkazak in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah.
It said that if you, no, not Kerchkazak, it was on YouTube. If you spread the sun apart, either you could kill it with water, but the sun isn't fire, it's a ball of neutrons and protons that are hot. The water would only make it burn brighter.
So the sun is mostly hydrogen, which is a proton and an electron. Now there's other elements as well, like helium and all of the other elements, but mostly it's hydrogen. Mostly it's a proton surrounded by an electron. And most of the sun, the proton and the electron are actually separate. They're floating around in this big kind of soup we call a plasma. So you could kind of kill the sun in a way if you could somehow remove all of that material and move it far enough apart that it was no longer hot, which would happen if you move them far enough apart. I'm not sure how water comes into it, except that you could potentially cool down parts of the sun, I suppose, if you had enough water that was at a low temperature. But yeah, the sun is made up of the same kind of stuff we are, but mostly it's hydrogen. And okay, a question about, let's see, water and let's see. Yeah, so whenever we're speculating about these kinds of things, it's always interesting because you have to really be very clear about your assumptions of what's happening. But if we're talking about the sun as the sun, you would probably actually just blow any water off into the outer solar system with the solar wind. Um, it wouldn't necessarily be broken apart, but it could be. And the as far as adding to the sun, you probably couldn't add any significant amount.
I heard something about bacterium that concentrate iron.
I do not know the species name. That's a good question. I should look that up. But it is magnetotactic, which essentially means that they make little magnets inside of the cell. And I'm not sure that it's very well understood why they do that, but it's a pretty interesting phenomenon, and it's really useful for this kind of study because it does concentrate that iron, so it makes it easier to find those very few iron 60 atoms amid all the other stuff that's out there.
What is the range of the radius of gamma ray burst? Bottom line, is it as wide as the Earth?
So I think the short answer is no. Gamma ray bursts produce mostly light, which are photons that are not affected by magnetic fields. Now, when it comes to cosmic rays, one of the details I left out is that cosmic rays are affected by magnetic fields. And in particular, the sun's magnetic field and the magnetic fields that are in between the stars and the Earth's magnetic field and so on. So the cosmic ray paths are quite complicated because of that. But as far as the photons go, the light from a gamma ray burst or a supernova just passes straight on through unless there's a lot of dust or something like that to block it out. So that does get into an interesting aspect of how supernovae occur, though. So in high mass stars, iron is produced by the fusion reactions in the core, but it turns out that producing iron through fusion takes in energy instead of releasing energy. So normally through a star's lifespan, fusion is putting nuclei together and releasing energy, which helps to sustain the star, to help keep its weight from collapsing inward. But when you get to iron inside of the core of a star, that iron fusion actually absorbs energy instead of producing energy. And so when that starts to occur, now the balance is offset. There's not as much outward energy going out. There's more gravitational force inward, not more, but the same amount, but less balance from the input from fusion. So that's one of the key things that happens that leads to a supernova explosion. So the star kind of kills itself with iron in a sense for certain kinds of stuff. Let's see, what percentage of gamma ray bursts are coming from neutron stars or from other sources? That's a good question. I'm not sure what the percentages are that are known now. There's been a lot of activity in this in recent years, but I haven't followed all of the details on that. I think my general understanding is that long gamma ray bursts, which are associated with supernova, normal kind of supernova, are more common. I'm not sure what the fraction is, though.
Are any of the mass extinctions a candidate for being caused by supernova?
We've identified a couple that actually might be connected to this kind of event. One is at the end of the Ordovician period, about 450 million years ago. The reason we think that that might be connected is there are patterns of extinction which match what we would expect. In particular, organisms that lived at the top of the water went extinct more frequently than those that lived at the bottom, and water is protective against UV and muons to some extent. So that fits. There's also a latitudinal gradient. So there is a higher extinction in sort of mid-latitudes versus the poles or the equator. And that fits with some of our predictions from our modeling as well. So that's a possibility. Another one is in the Devonian period. And there was some information from studies of fossils that there was an increase in ultraviolet light at that time. So one can look at fossilized pollen, for instance, and see a change that indicates a high UV exposure. There are a couple of different ideas about what might have caused that, and one of them is potentially a supernova or gamma ray burst. Let's see. How can you predict whether the gamma ray burst will be short or long? Okay, so that's a good question. As opposed to predicting, what we're really doing is connecting different observations. So when a gamma ray burst is first observed, it is observed as this blast of high energy light we call gamma rays. And there are a couple of different satellites that are specifically designed to detect these. So they're just sitting out there waiting for a blast of gamma rays to come along. When they detect one of those, they immediately send out an alert to astronomers all over the world, who then can direct their telescopes, either ones that you can look through with your eyes, visible light telescopes, or other kinds of telescopes, radio telescopes, things like that. And they can follow up on that observation. So when something like the Swift Space Telescope, for instance, sees a gamma ray burst, they have a general idea of which direction in the sky it's coming from. They say, hey, astronomers, go look at that part of the sky and see if there's something there. What's been done is that for these long gamma ray bursts, many observations have followed up and found supernova explosions associated with that. So observationally, we think it's a strong correlation between those. There's also theoretical reasons to think that they happen that way, just based on trying to understand the mechanics of it as well. The short gamma ray bursts, when we observe short ones, they tend to be observed with merger events as well. So mostly this is an observational correlation that astronomers have been able to come to.
Are there structures that survive the radiation? Is it possible there are different living systems that are adapted to survive?
So one of the things that we have found is that the effects on life in particular would be very different depending on the particular organisms. So I mentioned at the Ordovician period, there's this correlation of depth in the water with survival. Organisms that live toward the bottom survive more than those that lived at the top. There could be many reasons for that, but one possibility is that they're just protected from any kind of stuff that's coming from space, basically. If you've got ultraviolet light, it's rapidly filtered out by water. If you got muons, they tend to be more filtered out as well. So those kinds of correlations we can look for. Certain organisms that live in certain environments will be more protected. Certain organisms are just more adapted in general. So as I mentioned, my biology collaborator had been studying some organisms that we thought originally would be very badly damaged by UV. And it turns out that they really weren't. And the conclusion we came to is that they are probably already very well adapted to the UV. And so adding a little bit more, they don't really care that much. doesn't do any particular extra damage to them. So yeah, it definitely depends on who you are, where you live. All those factors are important. Let's see, what distance do we need to be away to not be affected? So this depends on the particular type of event. For a gamma ray burst, just because it's so intense, we're talking thousands of light years. We think probably 6,000 light years or so is a danger distance. Those are relatively rare, though, so those don't happen very often. For a more normal kind of supernova, we're looking at probably about 20, let's see, 20 parsecs, about 60 light years or so. So much closer, about a couple order magnitude closer, but again, relatively unlikely within that distance. So in general, we think that on the order of a few 100 million years, we get something close enough within that. But we're talking tens to hundreds or thousands of light years here.
Do you think there are tachyons?
Let's see. I'll give you my usual answer to interesting questions like this. We don't have any data they exist, so I don't know. Yeah, is there any reason to think they do? Yeah, maybe. There's math. Some math out there that people think indicates that tachyons, which are faster than, let's see, traveling backwards in time, faster than light particles, something like that. It's been a while since I thought about these. Yeah, the interesting idea, but no direct evidence.
Thank you. What would be the nearest star that would be capable of going either supernova or gamma radiation to the extent that we would feel it?
Right, good question. So right now, there aren't any within what we would consider a danger distance. Betelgeuse is one of the closest that we think will happen as a supernova in the near future. We don't know exactly when that might be, but too far away to have any direct effect on us. As far as gamma ray bursts go, it's tricky to identify the stars that might produce them. We don't know of any nearby that are likely to do that, but the short variety is associated with the merger of two neutron stars, and those are potentially very hard to see. So it's possible there are some neutron star pairs floating around out there in our neighborhood that we don't see. It's not very likely, but it is possible. So I mean, the short version is we don't know of any right now that are nearby. Okay, yeah, so gamma ray bursts all have a fairly similar energy output, which defines how far away they have to be to damage the Earth. Dust in the Milky Way doesn't really interact with gamma rays very much. It does with visible light and some other forms. Gamma rays can pass through for the most part pretty easily. So that doesn't do a whole lot for us.
I would like to thank Dr. Thomas and see you all next time.
All right, well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. All right, take care, everyone.